Whispers spread like wildfire through Cross Hollow about the girl too large for a wedding dress, too soft-spoken to fight back, and the father who sold her like cattle to a man who lived above the clouds. They said the mountain man was a brute, a beast, a recluse who spoke to no one and buried his past in the snow. But what no one expected was that he'd treat her like royalty. Why would a feared man cherish the one everyone else cast aside? And what happens when the past comes looking to reclaim what it sold? When the mountain held its breath and the girl stood tall, one question lingered in the wind. Was it punishment or providence? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that stories like these still matter because they carry the weight of dignity, second chances, and quiet strength. If you believe that compassion can outshine cruelty, then you're already part of this journey. Let me know which state you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. It helps us keep telling stories that remind the world what it means to stand up, even when the world turns away. Dust curled in the late summer heat, rising from the boots of men who spoke in half-truths and spat tobacco like punctuation. Cross Hollow wasn't much, just a splintered stretch of buildings, a church that leaned westward like it had grown tired of praying, and a saloon that poured more secrets than whiskey. In a town where stories traveled faster than wagons, one name stuck like sap: Eloise Mercer. She walked, with her eyes lowered, wide-brimmed bonnet tugged low, as if it could shield her from the stairs. She was large, soft-bodied, and softer still in voice. A girl of 16 summers, shaped more by shame than sunlight, and never once taught to believe she deserved kindness. Her dresses were sewn from feed sacks, her shoes always a size too small. Children called her Piggy Lou behind their hands. Adults called her nothing at all. Silas Mercer, her father, made sure of that. A wiry man with a jaw like an axe blade and eyes full of bile, Silas ruled his home with ridicule and fists. After his wife died birthing the very child he now cursed, he'd grown meaner than whiskey gone bad. His anger fermented over years, turning to something rancid. "Useless girl," he muttered one morning, watching Eloise try to sweep the porch while the broom bristles caught her hem. "Can't even trap a husband with all that meat on your bones. Ain't no man want to haul around a girl who eats more than he earns." She didn't reply. She never did. Words only seemed to fan the flames in him. She just swept harder, red-faced and silent, pretending her knuckles didn't ache from the night before. That week, Silas came back from the saloon, stinking of sweat and something slicker opportunity. He tossed his hat onto the table and looked at her with the kind of smile that made her feel cold in the lungs. "I found someone," he said. "Man up in the mountains, Gideon Blackthorne." "Heard of him?" Eloise shook her head. "Don't surprise me. Folks don't speak his name unless they got to. Recluse. Lives past Devil's Creek, near Wolfstone Ridge. They say he ain't right in the head. Killed a man once with his bare hands. Word. Inclined. Inclined. Inclined." She swallowed, her hands still resting on the wash basin. "He's got land, real land, and he's alone. Wants a woman or someone to keep the house." Her fingers clenched the edge of the basin. "You want me to marry him?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Silas chuckled, dry as a bone. "Ain't no marriage, girl. He don't want vows. He wants labor, wants silence. I told him you'd do just fine." The wash water rippled as the basin trembled. "You sold me?" His face turned like lightning. He crossed the room in 3 strides and slapped her with the back of his hand. "Don't you use that tone with me. After all I done for you. This is a chance, you hear? He's taken a burden off my back. One way or another, you're leaving this house come sundown." And so she did. By dusk, she was loaded onto the back of a mule-drawn wagon, a single trunk at her feet, and shame knotted in her throat. Her father's coin purse jingled behind her like a funeral bell. As the town faded into the dust, not one soul came to say goodbye. They reached the forest line by nightfall, and the driver said nothing, only nodded ahead at a dark silhouette waiting in the trees. He was tall, broader than she imagined, with a beard like coarse bark and a rifle slung lazy across his back. "Blackthorne," the driver muttered. "She's yours." The man said nothing. Eloise stepped down, her legs shaking. She met his eyes gray, cold, unreadable, and for a heartbeat, she swore she saw something flicker there, Not cruelty, not desire, something else. He turned without a word and began walking into the woods. She followed. Behind her, the wagon turned and rattled back toward town, carrying no one but the echo of a father who'd sold his daughter for silver and spite. The road grew narrow the farther they traveled, trading dust and sunlight for shade and silence. Trees rose like sentinels on either side of the wagon, pine and birch stretching heavenward, their branches thick enough to steal the warmth from the afternoon sunday. The driver, a sun-spotted man with a hat too big for his head, kept his mouth shut the whole way. He hadn't spoken to her once since they left the edge of Cross Hollow, hadn't even glanced her way. Eloise sat on the rough wooden bench, hands clenched in her lap, the weight of her father's betrayal pressing harder than the trunk at her feet. Her dress clung damp to her skin, and the sounds of civilization had long since vanished. All that remained now was the rhythmic creak of wheels and the cry of distant birds that didn't sound altogether friendly. They say this forest eats folk, she remembered hearing a boy mutter in town once, eyes wide with the pleasure of fear. Got ghosts that walk and wolves that don't die right. She hadn't believed it then. But now, wrapped in this growing quiet, she wasn't so sure. The deeper they went, the more the trees seemed to lean inward like gossiping old women. The light changed too, thick and greenish, like being underwater. End of the line, the driver said at last, pulling back on the reins. The wagon jerked to a stop near a break in the trees, where the trail ended at a clearing littered with stones and roots. Eloise looked up and saw him. He was standing beneath a hemlock tree, half-shadowed and unmoving. Gideon Blackthorn, taller than she expected. He looked like a slab of mountain himself, broad-shouldered, thick-armed, face hidden under a dark beard and a brimmed hat. He didn't come forward, just stood there, rifle over his shoulder, eyes fixed on her like she was something he meant to study before deciding whether or not to speak. Silas Mercer dismounted from the front of the wagon. He hadn't ridden the whole way up, just met them at the bend near Devil's Creek. He wiped his brow, more out of habit than sweat. "There she is," Silas grunted. "Strong enough to carry her weight, and she don't talk much unless provoked." Eloise's face burned, but she didn't flinch. Not anymore. Silas stepped toward Gideon, pulling a small leather pouch from his coat. It jingled like broken promises. He tossed it into Gideon's outstretched hand. "Fair's fair. She's yours." There was a pause long enough for a breeze to rustle the pines. Gideon didn't look at Silas. He didn't look at the coins. He simply gave a single, solemn nod. Then he turned away. "Go on, then," Silas said, waving his hand like shooing a stray dog. Eloise stepped down from the wagon, her shoes sinking slightly into the pine-needled earth. Her trunk was too heavy to carry far, but before she could speak, Gideon walked back, lifted it with one arm, and turned again. Still silent, she followed him. She had no other direction to go. Behind her, the wagon creaked and groaned as it turned back toward the world she had come from. Her father's voice, sharp and impatient, echoed one last time. "You mind him now, girl. Do what you're told." Then the wagon rolled away, swallowed by trees. Eloise did not look back. The forest was darker here, the air cooler. Birds called out in warning, or maybe welcome. She couldn't tell. Gideon's boots made almost no sound on the trail. Her own feet crunched twigs with every step. He didn't speak, but slowed his pace so she could keep up. They walked until the trail disappeared completely, replaced by the wild. Still, he said nothing. But when the wind shifted and her bonnet flew loose, catching on a low branch, Gideon stopped. Without turning, he reached back, plucked the bonnet free, and held it out behind him. She took it, her fingers grazing his for the briefest moment. That was the first time she saw it, barely a flicker in his posture, in the set of his shoulders. Not cruelty, not kindness either, but something in between, something watchful. And though she did not know it yet, she had just stepped into the place where her story would begin again. The cabin stood like it had grown from the earth itself, logs weathered silver, stone chimney, wrapped in ivy, moss, softening the corners where axe and hammer had once labored. Smoke curled from the chimney like a quiet breath. Eloise paused at the edge of the clearing, her skirt catching on the stiff needles of a low pine. Gideon moved ahead without waiting. The heavy trunk balanced on his shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. When he reached the door, he didn't open it for her. He set the trunk down beside the threshold, gave her one short glance, nothing lingering, and stepped inside. The door remained open. Eloise followed. The cabin's interior smelled of cedar and smoke. A wood stove hissed faintly in the corner, red coals tucked under its iron belly. A narrow bed rested against one wall, its frame built from raw timber and draped with an old woolen quilt. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, one of them covered in dust, shelves lined with jars, beans, rice, dried berries. A rifle hung on the wall beside a faded map of the mountains. No paintings, no photographs. Gideon walked to the far side of the cabin, picked up a log from the stack near the stove, and fed the fire. He didn't speak. He didn't explain. He just moved with the silent rhythm of a man used to solitude. Eloise hovered near the door. Her hands were folded together, knuckles white. The air inside was warmer than she expected. It prickled her skin. "There's water out back," Gideon said finally, voice like gravel. He nodded toward the back door, then returned to the corner where his tools hung neatly along the wall. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came. She simply nodded. He didn't offer a place for her things, nor suggest where she should sleep, but he didn't stop her either when she unlatched the trunk and pulled out the folded cotton nightdress her mother once mended with lavender thread. She chose a corner near the hearth and laid the rolled blanket she'd brought with her on the floor. Gideon didn't protest. When the moon rose high above the trees and silence settled over the cabin like snow, Eloise sat curled on her makeshift bed, knees pulled to her chest. The fire threw long shadows across the beams, flickering over the map, the jars, the man-shaped stillness at the other end of the room. She tried to be invisible, but the tears came anyway, silent at first, sliding down her cheeks without sound. Then the sobs shook her guttural, breathless, the kind that come from somewhere deep and hollow. She buried her face in her arms, afraid to wake him, afraid not to. Gideon did not stir, or if he did, he made no sign of it. The storm inside her broke, then passed. Slowly, her breath evened. The warmth of the fire, the solid feel of the wood beneath her, the quiet that didn't hurt it, all began to settle around her like a balm. For the first time in her memory, no one called her names. No one cursed her weight, her slowness, her tears. There was no comfort, no tenderness, not yet. But there was space, room to breathe. She drifted to sleep with her hand near the fire's warmth and the sound of wind rustling through pine needles outside. In the stillness, something shifted, not in him, not yet, but in her. She did not know it, but in that silent cabin, where no one told her what she was worth, a question began to take root. What if she was worth something after all? Mornings came colder in the mountains, even in early fall. The sun touched the treetops long before it ever kissed the ground, and the mist lingered like a secret no one was ready to tell. Eloise awoke each day with the ache of unfamiliar labor in her shoulders and the sore pull of dreams too long buried. The first few days passed in silence, just the rustle of firewood, the clink of tin bowls, the creak of the cabin walls breathing through the cold. Gideon moved through it all like a ghost tethered to flesh, seen but never intruding. He didn't speak to her unless necessary, and when he did, it was with short words and eyes that never lingered. But the silence between them was not like her father's. There was no blade in it, no trapdoor ready to spring. It was a silence made of space, a quiet that neither punished nor pressed. At first, she didn't know what to do with that kind of silence. It felt like stepping into a room and finding no judgment waiting. Each morning, wood appeared stacked neatly beside the hearth, cut, split, and placed with care. The first time, she thought perhaps she'd missed him doing it. But after the third morning, when she woke and found a clean axe leaning by the door and a whetstone tucked in beside it, she understood. He was watching. Not hovering, not controlling, just noticing. Her needs, her movements, the rhythm she was building. On the 5th day, she found a bundle of books set gently on the table. Not new worn spines and yellowing pages, but real books. The Pioneer's Herb Guide, field sketches of western birds, stories of the old frontier. Her fingers trembled as she opened one and found a pressed feather between the pages. She looked toward Gideon, who stood outside chopping more wood. face turned to the task. He didn't look her way, but she felt his awareness, like a presence in the air, steady, unmoving. She began to read aloud when he was out tending to the fence line. Not loudly, just enough to hear her own voice again, soft and unsure at first. The words stumbled, then steadied. In the pages, she found stories of women who brewed medicines from pine needles, who tracked wolves by their paw marks, who planted life where nothing had grown before. She traced the illustrations with her fingertip and started copying them into a blank ledger she found in her trunk. Her lines were shaky, but her hand remembered more than she thought it would. Then one morning, the wind blew gentle through the window pane, and something new lay on the sill. Wildflowers, mountain asters, pale and trembling, arranged not by accident, but in a small circle, tied with a fray of twine. She blinked at them, unsure what to feel. It was the first beautiful thing anyone had ever given her. No reason, no trade, just placed there, silent and waiting to be noticed. She touched the petals with reverent fingers, then looked outside. Gideon was at the edge of the clearing, back turned, hat low, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate movements. He never looked her way. But when she stepped outside and placed the flowers in a chip jar by the windowsill, she knew he'd see it. She began to hum as she swept the cabin. Not loud, not for him, just for herself. And in the stillness between the trees, the thaw had begun not in fire or thunder, but in the small, persistent warmth that comes when frost surrenders to the Sunday. The scent of yeast and wood smoke braided together as the day deepened. Outside, the leaves had begun their quiet transformation, blushes of amber and rust painting the canopy above the cabin. Inside, Eloise stood barefoot on the worn planks of the floor, her hands dusted with flour, her brow lined with quiet focus. The dough she had worked for hours now rose in the cast-iron pot near the stove, wrapped in a towel, cradled like something sacred. She wasn't sure what made her try. Maybe it was the way Gideon had left a small bag of ground wheat beside the dry goods without saying a word. Maybe it was the way her hands had begun to itch for usefulness, for creation rather than stillness. Or maybe it was the way the silence between them had grown companionable, not warm, not yet, but less lonely. She needed to give back something that wasn't just breath and presence. Bread, perhaps, could be enough. The fire crackled, low and steady, and as the bread baked, she began to tidy the shelves. She wiped away dust that had gathered thick as silence. She arranged the jars so that beans sat beside beans, spices lined up like little soldiers. She swept the corners, shook out the woolen blanket, folded the spare linens with hands that remembered her mother's motions. The cabin began to change under her touch, not into something soft, but something tended. That evening, when Gideon returned from chopping birchwood along the ridge, he found the table set. No tablecloth, no fanfare, just a plate, a knife, and a small loaf of bread wrapped in a clean cloth. Eloise stood near the hearth, not quite meeting his gaze, her arms crossed in something like defense or maybe pride. He said nothing. He picked up the knife, sliced the bread, and took a bite. He chewed, and then he ate another slice. No compliment, no nod, no words, but he finished it. All of it. When he stood to clean his plate, he left behind one thing. A piece of birchwood, freshly cut, smoothed, and sanded, set on the table as if in offering. The next morning, while he was gone, Eloise opened her notebook and began to sketch. She sat near the window where the light was good, the birch block beside her like a quiet companion. Her pencil moved slow but steady, shaping wings and eyes, curling vines, fur, and feather. A wren peering from behind a boot, a squirrel curled around a lantern, a face she did not recognize but wished she might someday meet. Each drawing seemed to pull something loose from inside her, something soft and wordless. By week's end, a small wooden sparrow appeared on her windowsill. No note, no explanation, just there. Its wings were tucked to its sides, and its beak was slightly parted, as though caught mid-song. She picked it up and ran her thumb along its grain. It was imperfect, one eye slightly bigger than the other, but to her, it was beautiful. She placed it beside her drawings, where it watched over the notebook like a guardian. That night, she cooked stew. He ate it without complaint. She began to hum again while she stirred, the tune slower now, fuller, and when she looked toward him by the firelight, she noticed his eyes were no longer unreadable, only quiet, like the hush before dawn. The forest had fallen unusually quiet that morning. The wind, usually steady through the trees, had gone still. The birds, so vocal at dawn, had hushed their songs, leaving behind an uneasy silence that settled like a heavy wool blanket over the clearing. Eloise noticed it first while pulling water from the pump beside the cabin. The stillness felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. She straightened, clutching the handle of the pail, eyes scanning the tree line. The mist hadn't yet burned off, and shadows moved too easily between the trunks. The air carried a different scent now, thick, musky, and sharp, like wet fur and earth disturbed. Then she heard it, the low, guttural huff of breath, not human. The bear emerged from between the trees, like a shadow peeled loose from the dark. Massive, mottled, with fur matted in places and eyes that glinted with the dull hunger of something that hadn't eaten well in days. It lumbered forward on slow, deliberate paws, sniffing the air, nostrils flaring toward the scent of last night's stew pot left to cool by the back step. Eloise froze. Her throat tightened, and the bucket slipped from her hand, hitting the ground with a hollow thud. Water spilled across her boots and soaked into the earth, but she couldn't move. Her heart pounded so hard it drowned out the birds, the wind, even the growl that rumbled low from the bear's chest. Her legs locked beneath her, her hands trembling at her sides. The cabin door creaked open behind her. Gideon stepped out without rush or alarm. His boots barely made a sound on the porch. In one hand, he held his rifle, but it dangled low, barrel pointed at the ground. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He moved like someone who understood exactly what he was facing. "Back inside," he said in a tone that wasn't raised, but left no room for argument. But Eloise couldn't move. The bear had seen her. It lowered its head, sniffed again, and took a step closer, claws digging into the soft soil with a sound like knives on leather. Gideon stepped between them. He didn't lift the rifle, not yet. Instead, he raised one arm slowly, palm out, and began to speak not to Eloise, but to the animal. "Easy," he said. "No trouble here. Nothing worth your pain." The bear huffed again, pacing a little, scenting the man who now stood tall and unyielding between it and the cabin. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of firewood, smoke, metal. Something in the bear paused. Gideon didn't blink. Another long moment passed before the creature turned with a snort and lumbered back into the trees, the underbrush shivering in its wake. Only after the last rustle faded did Gideon lower his arm. He turned, his eyes finally landing on Eloise. She stood rooted to the spot, face pale, hands still trembling. He stepped toward her slowly, rifle slung back over his shoulder. "You did well," he said, voice low but firm, staying still. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken to her. 4 words, but they landed like a stone dropped in a still pond. She nodded, tears pricking the corners of her eyes, though she didn't quite understand why. Not fear, not relief, something deeper. The way his voice reached into her and held her steady, even after the danger had passed. He didn't touch her, didn't offer more words, just picked up the dropped pail, handed it to her, and walked back toward the woodshed, as though the moment hadn't cracked open something between them. But it had. That night, she set the stew pot inside before bed, and on the windowsill, next to the carved sparrow, she placed a small drawing of the bear, powerful and terrifying, yes, but turned away. Not destroyed, not hated, just understood. The ground behind the cabin was stubborn. Roots coiled beneath the soil like knotted veins, clinging to rocks and old frost. But Eloise had known stubbornness all her life, in the narrowness of townsfolk, in her father's fists, in the silence she'd once thought was safety. This kind of stubbornness, the earth kind, was different. It didn't strike or sneer. It merely waited to see if she'd try again. And she did. The first morning, she brought out the rusted hoe she'd found hanging on the back wall, its handle cracked but strong. She tested the weight of it, then drove it into the earth with more hope than strength. The blade caught on something hard. She pressed again. It gave. Soil loosened. Behind her, Gideon emerged from the woodshed, carrying 2 lengths of planked wood and a bundle of twine. He didn't speak, but set them beside her and began measuring out the edge of what would become a plot rough, wide, and full of promise. They worked side by side, not in conversation, but in rhythm. She struck the soil, he turned it with a spade. He removed rocks and roots, piling them off to the side. She scattered them with her boot and returned to her digging. By afternoon, her back ached, sweat beating at her temples, but she didn't stop. There was something sacred in it, this labor that asked for nothing but patience and gave in return a chance to grow. The next day, he brought her seeds, wrapped in wax paper, labeled in careful handwriting: onion, tomato, yarrow, thyme. A few mystery ones, their names smudged with time. She unfolded them one by one, her fingers trembling with something close to reverence. "Where'd you get these?" she asked softly. Gideon just shrugged. "Saved them." That was enough. She read every page of the old herb guide, underlined what she didn't understand, and sketched what she did. She knelt beside the rows with fingers dug deep, planting seed after seed with care that was almost maternal. She named each cluster of sprouts like children: Timothy, Lucille, Josephine, Sprouticus. When she spoke to the tomatoes, it wasn't for effect. It was because it felt natural. The garden listened better than people ever had. And Gideon, he watched, not with the judgment she used to know, but with quiet attention. He listened as she explained how bees liked blue flowers best, how marigolds kept pests away, how the soil smelled different after rain. Sometimes, when she laughed at herself at the lopsided way a row turned, or the worm she thought was a root, he let the corner of his mouth tilt just slightly upward. Not a smile, not quite, but close. One morning, as she crouched beside the row of sprouting basil, a bumblebee landed on her wrist. She stilled, breath caught. It lingered for a second, then buzzed off toward the flowers she'd planted in a crooked curve. She laughed, a sudden, surprised sound that felt foreign in her throat. She covered her mouth as though it might break if she used it too much. Gideon, from the porch, looked up from his carving. He didn't speak, but his eyes stayed on her a beat longer than usual, noticing, remembering, maybe even hoping. The garden grew slowly, like all good things do. The shoots reached for the sun with the same quiet tenacity Eloise was just beginning to find in herself. Dirt got under her nails and sweat soaked her collar, but she never complained. This was work she chose. This was life she was making. And in the warmth of the turning soil, the girl who had been sold began to root herself in a new kind of belonging, one that asked nothing but effort and gave everything in return. The fire had burned low, casting only a faint orange glow that danced across the rough interior of the cabin. Outside, the trees whispered to one another in wind-bent murmurs, their shadows crawling like old memories across the window panes. Gideon had gone out just before dusk, saying only that he needed to check the snare line before the storm rolled in. He hadn't returned yet. Eloise sat on the floor, wrapped in her shawl, her eyes scanning the lines she'd drawn earlier that day, in her notebook herbs labeled in tidy print, a sketched sparrow perched on a sprig of rosemary. But her mind wandered. It had been doing that more often lately, tugged by unasked questions, the space between silences growing more filled with meaning than absence. Her gaze drifted to the far side of the cabin, to the only piece of furniture that didn't serve a daily purpose, a low, wide trunk made of dark wood and iron bands. It sat beneath the rifle rack like a forgotten relic. She'd never seen Gideon open it. He dusted it sometimes, but only with the kind of quiet reverence one gives to something both precious and painful. Curiosity whispered to her like a child at the edge of a closed door. She rose, barefoot, the floorboards creaking faintly under her steps. The fire popped behind her, and the wind scratched at the shutter. She knelt before the trunk and ran her fingers along the cool metal latch. It was locked, but the key hung from a nail just above the mantel, half hidden by a dangling horseshoe. She hesitated, heart quickening, then reached for it. The lock clicked open with a reluctant sigh. She lifted the lid slowly. Inside, the scent of lavender and old paper rose like a memory. The first thing she saw was a bundle of letters, tied with twine stained at the edges. Beneath them, a child's cloth doll rested on a folded quilt, its button eyes loose, the stitching of its smile nearly unraveled. Her fingers hovered over it but did not touch. Beside it lay a woman's locket, brass and worn, the clasp delicate. She opened it. Inside, a miniature portrait painted with care of a woman with golden hair and a soft smile. Opposite her, a small child with the same eyes, caught in mid-laugh. The breath caught in Eloise's throat. "I didn't say you could open that." She turned sharply. Gideon stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, hat in hand, eyes dark but not angry, just tired. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have." He stepped inside, set the hat on its peg, and knelt beside her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he reached into the trunk and lifted the locket gently from her hand. "That's Mary," he said, voice gravel-thick. "And Clara, my wife and daughter." Eloise lowered her eyes. "They're beautiful." "They were," he said. He closed the locket and placed it back in the trunk with deliberate care. "Raiders came through a mining town south of here, 10 years back. I'd gone to fetch supplies, came back to smoke and silence." Her heart cracked at the image. "I left everything after that," he continued. "The town, the law, the people who promised protection but never came. Built this place because the mountains don't lie. They just are. Hard, honest, like grief." She looked at him then, not just the beard and the rough skin and the scar along his jaw, but the weight he carried, worn like a second coat. "I didn't mean to pry," she said. "I know," he replied, "but you had to know eventually." He didn't raise his voice, didn't curse her. He simply closed the trunk, locked it again, and hung the key back in its place. As he walked past her, he paused. "Leave the fire burning tonight," he said. "Cold'll get worse before morning." Then he retreated to his chair, the silence folding around him once more. But it wasn't the same silence. It was shared now, no longer empty, but echoing. Ghosts had spoken. And though they still haunted, they no longer hid. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a sky scrubbed clean and pale, as though the mountains themselves had wept through the night. Mist clung low to the trees, and the smell of damp pine filled the air. Eloise was bent over the garden rose, coaxing a reluctant sprout from the earth, when the sound of hooves cracked through the quiet. She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, heart already climbing into her throat. No one ever came up this far, not unless they had reason. Gideon stepped out from the cabin, rifle slung over his shoulder, expression unreadable but alert. They both saw her at once, the figure on horseback, cloaked in brown, a wide-brimmed hat shielding her face. As the rider drew closer, Eloise saw a flash of silver at her throat, a crucifix. The woman dismounted with surprising grace for her age, and patted the side of her mule with a tenderness that spoke of long miles traveled together. "Morning," she said, voice calm and kind, like river water over stone. "I'm Sister Althea, preacher and midwife. I was told there's a woman living up here now." Eloise nodded, unsure whether to speak. Althea's eyes softened when they met hers. "You must be Miss Mercer." The name, spoken aloud, hit like a stone to the chest. Gideon stepped between them without a word. "I come in peace," Althea said gently, raising both hands. "No judgment, just a letter." She reached into her satchel and pulled out an envelope, its paper creased and dirt smudged. She handed it to Gideon, but her eyes remained on Eloise, watching, not prying. Gideon unfolded it, scanning the contents. His jaw tensed. Then he handed it silently to Eloise. Her fingers trembled as she took it. The handwriting was her father's, rigid, proud, every letter pressed down as if trying to force obedience into the ink. "Eloise, I trust this letter finds you in one piece. I've thought long and hard about the way we parted. A father can make mistakes, and I reckon I've made mine. You belong home. Things have changed since you left. There are folks interested in the land where you're staying, and I'd hate to see you caught up in something dangerous. Come back to town, where you'll be safe. I'll take care of everything, if you just come home where you belong. Your father." She read it twice, then let it fall into her lap. "He wants the land," she whispered. "Not me," Althea nodded slowly. "Rumors are circling in Cross Hollow. Talk of gold veins under Blackthorn's Ridge, new folks sniffing around with deeds and claims. And your father, he's been stirring the pot." Gideon's face was stone. Eloise's stomach churned. The fragile piece she'd begun to grow was already trembling. That letter, dressed in false repentance and false concern, was nothing more than a claim. Another transaction waiting to happen. "He doesn't care if I'm well," she said softly. "Only if I'm profitable." Althea looked at her with something close to pride. "I figured as much. That's why I brought the letter myself. Thought it best you heard it from someone who doesn't carry a ledger in her heart." Gideon remained silent, but his hand rested on the rifle a little longer than before. Eloise stood. The wind tugged at her skirts, and the garden behind her waved in soft green defiance. She looked to the trees, to the cabin, to the carved sparrow still perched on the window-sill. "I'm not going back," she said, and though her voice shook, her spine did not. Cross Hollow had never needed facts to fuel its stories. Truth was too slow for gossip, and the tongues of its people were quicker than a rattler in summer. By the time the leaves turned amber and gold along the mountain ridge, the tale of Eloise Mercer's disappearance had already grown teeth and horns. "She was sold," one said over a mug of bitter beer at the saloon. "No, stolen. That mountain man took her like some outlaw bride," another countered. "He put a spell on her," muttered Widow Talbert in hushed tones at Sunday service. "Big girls are easy prey for men like that. Lonely, desperate." They spoke of Gideon Blackthorne like a myth, half man, half menace. Some said he was raising a militia in the woods. Others whispered of devil marks on his cabin door, of strange howls at night that weren't quite wolves. No one admitted aloud that Silas Mercer had traded his daughter for coin and convenience. It was easier to pretend a sin hadn't occurred than to face the one who'd committed it. Silas, for his part, played the grieving father with theatrical precision. He stumbled into the general store with red eyes and slurred words, claiming he'd been tricked, that his daughter had been lured away by force, that she was mentally unwell and needed a firm hand. "That mountain man's got her brainwashed," he said, choking back crocodile tears. "My poor girl." It was into this ripe field of murmurs that Bram Caldwell arrived. He wore a vest too fine for the territory, and boots polished so clean they seemed offended by the dust. He arrived not on horseback, but in a coach pulled by two sleek chestnuts, his bags carried by a boy who didn't speak a word. He checked into the inn without introduction, but it wasn't long before folks learned his name and purpose. Caldwell was a land agent out of Fort Ridge. He worked papers better than he worked soil, and he carried with him documents, real ones. He claimed that detailed a mineral rights dispute north of Cross Hollow. Rumors of gold had long circled the hills beyond Devil's Creek, but now, with the sudden re-emergence of Eloise Mercer's name, those rumors were catching flame. He made his way to the sheriff's office, with a rolled parchment under one arm and the confident smile of a man who'd never been told no. "I represent Mr. Mercer," he announced. "We've reason to believe that a minor female has been unlawfully detained by a squatter living on contested land. We'll be pursuing legal reclamation of both the property and the girl." The sheriff, a man named Hal Brink, scratched his beard and said nothing. He had known Silas Mercer long enough to doubt the word reclamation. Still, Caldwell had the governor's seal on his letterhead, and the look of someone who made problems disappear with ink, not gunpowder. The whispers grew darker after that. "She'll be dragged back. They'll burn the cabin down. Blackthorne won't go quietly." And through it all, Eloise's name was passed around like a token. Not a person, a bargaining chip, a reason to fight, a girl who had become both legend and leverage. Back on the mountain, she felt the change like a shift in the wind. The animals grew skittish, the birds fell quiet at dusk, and Gideon, though he said nothing, began checking the rifle more often, his eyes drifting toward the ridgeline as if waiting for something he'd long tried to forget. The warning came not with words, but with the smell of smoke, sharp, acrid, distant. Gideon stood still as a stone at the edge of the clearing, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. Eloise was kneeling in the garden, brushing dirt from a ripening tomato, when she caught the change in the air. The birds had gone quiet again, just like they had before the bear, but this silence was heavier, expectant. Then came the sound of hooves, multiple riders, slow and deliberate, not rushing but not meandering either. A procession with purpose. Gideon moved without speaking. He slung his rifle over one shoulder and reached down to pick up the small axe near the chopping block, holding it with an ease that made her chest tighten. He nodded toward the cabin. "Inside," he said. But Eloise rose to her feet and shook her head. I'm not hiding. He looked at her for a long moment, longer than ever before, and though he said nothing, he didn't argue. He only turned to face the trail where the sound of the approaching riders thickened. Caldwell came into view first, his fine coat unbuttoned, revealing a holster that hung too clean to have ever seen use. Behind him rode 3 men, lean, mean-looking, faces smudged with dust and arrogance. They carried torches, not yet lit, but ready. One of them had a rolled document in his hand. Another had a length of rope tied to his saddle. Caldwell dismounted with the theatrical air of a man who thought himself important. He looked around the clearing like it was already his. "Blackthorn," he said, tugging off his gloves. "Afternoon." Gideon didn't reply. Caldwell cleared his throat. "I come on behalf of Mr. Silas Mercer and the territory of Westbridge. We have reason to believe you are unlawfully holding Miss Eloise Mercer on your property, which itself lies on contested land with newly discovered mineral value. I have with me," he gestured toward the man with the papers, "a writ of transfer and reclamation." Gideon's voice was calm. "That girl walked up this mountain on her own legs, and she'll leave the same way if she chooses to." Caldwell offered a tight, humorless smile. "Let's not turn this into a standoff, Mr. Blackthorn. There's gold under this ridge, and a girl who doesn't know what's best for her. We can take this to court, or we can settle it tonight." One of the hired men flicked his torch. Another spat into the dirt. Eloise stepped forward then, heart pounding, but voice steady. "I'm not property," she said, "and I'm not confused. You can tell my father he gave me away like a mule, and he doesn't get to change his mind now that the dirt has value." Caldwell blinked. The men shifted in their saddles. Gideon didn't move, but there was something different in his stance, something that crackled like dry timber before a blaze. "I won't warn you twice," Gideon said. "You ride back down that trail while your horses are still upright." Caldwell hesitated. There was something in Gideon's eyes, not madness, but certainty, the kind that men carried when they had nothing left to lose and one thing left to protect. The land agent clicked his tongue and turned back to his mount. "This isn't over," he said, mounting up. "The law will come. You'll wish you took the deal." "Likely," Gideon said, "but not today." The riders turned and rode back the way they'd come, leaving behind the smell of sweat, dust, and a promise of trouble. Eloise exhaled slowly, fists still clenched at her sides. Gideon looked at her. "You spoke well," he said, and though the fear still trembled in her bones, she found herself standing taller. So did he. The church bell rang low that Sunday, tolling not just for the hour, but for the weight of something stirring in the soul of Cross Hollow. The townsfolk gathered as they always did, dusting off hats and settling onto worn pews with murmurs about weather and crops, but their eyes lingered longer on one another. The story of Eloise Mercer no longer just whispered, had cracked open something deeper, and at the front of the chapel stood Sister Althea, back straight, silver hair coiled beneath her bonnet like a crown of quiet rebellion. She didn't take the pulpit that morning, with scripture in hand. Instead, she laid a folded note on the edge of the lectern, the very letter Silas had penned, the one Eloise had refused, and looked out at the people who had long prided themselves on minding their own business, even when it bled. "I won't speak from the book today," she began, her voice steady but fierce, "not because God has fallen silent, but because he's speaking in another way right now, and it's through truth." A hush spread like oil on water. "You all know the name Eloise Mercer," she said, "and most of you have used it with a sneer, called her names when she walked by, avoided her in stores, judged her size, her quiet, her very breath. You all watched as Silas Mercer tore her down, day after day, and none of you stopped him." Someone in the back shifted. Another cleared their throat. "I saw her," Althea continued, voice gaining strength. "Up in the mountains, past Devil's Creek. I saw a girl who was no longer cowering, no longer flinching. I saw her growing herbs and drawing birds and baking bread. I saw her laugh, not because someone told a joke, but because her heart is finally free enough to feel joy." The room remained still, faces pale, eyes averted, but guilt began to move through the crowd like a slow wind. "And who was beside her?" Althea asked. "Gideon Blackthorn, the man you've all called a savage, a killer, a recluse. But I saw a man who left wildflowers at her window, who built space for her voice when none of you would even listen to her name. There was a long pause, then a voice low, older, from the left side of the chapel. I remember Silas beat his wife, back when she was carrying Eloise, came into the store with bruises more than once. A woman near the back stood. He told my husband she was a burden God gave him to test his patience. A man by the window nodded slowly. Blackthorn never once came down here to cause harm, never asked for nothing, just wanted to be left alone. Sister Althea stepped down from the pulpit. Then let's stop pretending we don't know the truth. That girl was discarded like garbage, and the man you fear is the one who picked her up, dusted her off, and gave her a place to grow. And now Silas, backed by men who want gold more than justice, aims to drag her down again. I say no. A murmur rose. This time not of fear, but of assent. Outside, the wind shifted east, and in the town that had once shut its eyes, they began at last to see. The night began with stillness, the kind of stillness that comes just before a storm or a sin. Crickets chirped lazily in the underbrush, and the fire inside the cabin crackled low, casting soft light over Eloise's sketchbook as she added careful lines to a drawing of the garden in full bloom. Gideon had gone out earlier to check the traps, saying little, as usual, but with a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there the week before. The threats from Caldwell still hung in the air like smoke that hadn't yet risen. It was just past midnight when the first crack sounded. Not thunder, not a tree limb. A pop like timber splitting under force too close, too sharp. Eloise froze, head lifting from her notebook. A moment later, the window flickered orange. She stood quickly and stepped to the door, flinging it open. The barn was ablaze. Flames roared along the dry pitch of the roof, climbing into the night like a beast unchained. The smell of smoke was thick and immediate, and the heat hit her like a slap. Panic surged in her chest, not just for the structure but for what was inside: tools, stores, and the pair of goats Gideon had coaxed through the winter like kin. "Gideon!" she shouted into the trees, but there was no reply. Her feet moved before her thoughts caught up. She bolted across the yard barefoot, the cold dirt already warming beneath falling embers. Her lungs burned as she pushed open the barn door. Fire curled along the rafters and danced across the straw-strewn floor. One goat bleated frantically from the back stall, trapped behind a fallen beam. She didn't hesitate. Smoke blinded her, but she dropped to her knees and crawled, one arm shielding her face. The wood was too hot to touch, but she found a gap and shoved her body through, wrapping her arms around the trembling animal. It kicked, panicked, but she pulled hard, ignoring the sting of splinters and flame. She barely made it to the entrance before the roof groaned, an ominous, cracking sound that came from the heart of the structure. A flaming rafter split loose and fell, and then Gideon was there. He came like a wave through the firelight, grabbing Eloise by the waist with one arm and dragging her free, the goat scrambling behind. They stumbled into the yard just as the barn collapsed behind them in a burst of cinders and smoke. The fire lit the night sky, throwing shadows across the clearing like ghosts come to dance. Gideon fell to his knees. Eloise cradled in his arms, soot smeared across her cheek, her breath ragged. "I'm okay," she coughed. "I'm okay. He was stuck, I had to." But Gideon wasn't listening. He pulled her close, one hand tangled in her hair, the other wrapped around her shoulders like he could hold her back from the grave. And then, without warning, the man who had not shed a tear in over a decade let go. He wept. He wept for the barn, for the fear, for the memory of another girl and another fire long ago. He wept for everything he thought he'd buried beneath the trees in silence. And Eloise, barely conscious, leaned into him, not afraid, not ashamed, just present. Down in Cross Hollow, the fire was seen from the church steeple first. Sister Althea rang the bell. Within minutes, townsfolk were roused, buckets filled, and a line of bodies began the slow climb up the mountain. Some carried blankets, others tools. One boy carried nothing but a Bible and a tin ladle. They moved not like a mob, but like a reckoning. For the first time in her life, Eloise saw a community rise not to destroy her, but to save what she'd built. The mountain, once feared, had finally called them to it, and this time they answered. The Cross Hollow Town Hall had never held so many bodies in silence. The windows stood open, letting in the late autumn breeze, but the air inside was still too thick to breathe right. Sunlight streamed through the dusty panes and caught on floating motes, like judgment made visible. Men stood in the back with their arms folded. Women sat straight-backed on hard benches, hands clenched in laps, eyes shifting between curiosity and unease. Children were kept outside, the occasion deemed too sharp-edged for their ears. At the front, behind a table with cracked legs and ink stains, sat Marshal Tillman, an aging man with a fading badge, but a mind sharp as barbed wire. He hadn't spoken yet, just watched, waiting. Caldwell was already on his feet, dressed in his tailored vest and smug certainty. He held a bundle of papers in one hand and a look of theatrical concern in the other. "What we have here," he said, voice smooth as Riverstone, "is a case of unlawful occupation and endangerment. A girl, Eloise Mercer, was taken against her will by a man known to have violent tendencies and a history of seclusion from civilized society. This man, Gideon Blackthorne, resides on a parcel of land which, I contend, does not legally belong to him. The mineral rights, as confirmed by our documents," he lifted the papers, "are under rightful claim by Mr. Silas Mercer, her father, who seeks her safe return and protection from further manipulation." Murmurs rippled across the room. Silas, seated near the front with arms crossed, looked every bit the grieving father, chin high, eyes wet at the corners. A snake in borrowed skin. Caldwell handed the documents to the marshal, who began thumbing through them without expression. "Letters, too," Caldwell added. "Proof of concern. Letters Mr. Mercer sent and received no reply to. A clear attempt to regain contact." He turned, gesturing toward Eloise, who stood near the door beside Sister Althea and Gideon. "This girl has been through much, we don't deny it, but her well-being is paramount, and it is the duty of this town and this law to return her to her rightful place before further harm is done." Silence followed, heavy, expectant. Then Eloise stepped forward. She walked without being asked, spine straight, palms flat at her sides. Her dress was plain, her face unpainted, but her voice when she began was steady. "My father didn't write those letters until after someone told him about gold," she said. "Before that, he beat me, called me a burden, sold me for coin, and didn't even wait to see if I lived. Gideon didn't take me. He opened his door and let me stay. And everything I've become since, stronger, braver, whole, didn't happen in a jail or a church pew. It happened on that mountain, with him." The crowd shifted, uneasy. Sister Althea stepped forward next. She laid her own bundle of papers on the table. "Here is Gideon Blackthorne's original homestead claim," she said, "signed and filed 12 years ago. Here are 3 witness statements from townsfolk, you know, who heard Silas boast about trading his daughter for supplies. And here," she held up another letter, "is the original draft of a letter forged in Caldwell's handwriting. Same ink, same phrasing, only this one didn't pass through the post." Caldwell's face paled. Silas stood sharply, hand twitching toward his coat, but 2 deputies moved before he could find whatever he was reaching for. The marshal spoke at last. "This town's seen too many shadows passed off as men, but today we choose light. Miss Mercer, you will not be forced to leave your home. Mr. Caldwell, you'll stay seated while we discuss forgery charges. And Mr. Mercer," he looked over his spectacles, "your rights as a father were burned the day you sold them." The gavel came down with a thud that echoed all the way to the mountains. And in that sound, judgment finally fell on the right heads. The morning after the town hall reckoning dawned clear and sharp, as though the mountains themselves had been holding their breath and now exhaled. Mist rolled down from the high ridges, spilling over the pines like a blessing. Gideon and Eloise stood on the cabin porch in the early light, silent, watching the trees sway in slow rhythm. The air smelled of ash and damp earth, remnants of fire, of change, of something new taking root. They heard the riders before they saw them. Not the clatter of Caldwell's hired men or the nervous trot of townsfolk, but the measured cadence of lawmen. A black-coated figure rode at the front, badge glinting in the sunlight, a satchel of papers strapped to his saddle. 2 deputies followed, each with rifles slung and eyes scanning the trail with disciplined ease. Marshal Joseph Finley dismounted with a grunt and a grace that spoke of long years in the saddle and longer years dealing with men who lied well. He tipped his hat to Gideon, then turned his eyes to Eloise. He didn't stare, didn't gawk, just nodded once, respectful. "I bring words from higher places," he said, unstrapping the satchel. "Territorial governor's seal, special commission attached." He pulled out a thick envelope, wax-stamped and folded twice. "Investigation into land disputes, property rights, and unlawful detention of a citizen under false pretenses. Town testimony's already been wired and reviewed. Seems your Mr. Caldwell's made a habit of fabricating claims across 4 counties." From the second horse, one of the deputies brought Caldwell forward, no longer smug, no longer smiling. His wrists were bound, his vest dirtied, his eyes sunken behind a sheen of disbelief. He looked smaller without his papers and posture, powerless. "Bram Caldwell," the marshal read aloud, "you are hereby arrested under the authority of the Western Territory for fraud, coercion, and attempted theft of sovereign land." He looked at Eloise. "Among other charges." Caldwell opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to beg, but one look from Gideon silenced him more effectively than any gag could have. The deputies led him toward the trees, where a wagon waited to carry him down to Fort Ridge, and a trial with fewer sympathetic ears. Silas came next, stumbling behind like a man clinging to a rope already frayed. His clothes were torn at the collar, his eyes bloodshot, face gaunt, but his voice, when he spoke, still carried that same poison it always had. "She's my daughter," he growled. "I raised her, fed her. You think a few drawings and dirt-streaked dresses make her a woman? You don't get to keep what's mine." The marshal raised a hand, silencing the murmurs that had begun to stir from the crowd gathering behind him. He looked at Eloise, not at Gideon, not at Silas. "At the heart of it," the marshal said, "what matters here is what she wants, not what anyone claims." He stepped aside and gestured toward Eloise. "Miss Mercer, do you wish to return with your father?" The world hushed. Eloise didn't flinch. She stepped forward, past Gideon, past the porch, past the old memory of who she had once been. "No," she said. Her voice was clear, rooted like the pines around them. "I'm already home." Silas's face twisted rage, confusion, defeat, folding into one another. He opened his mouth, but there was nothing left to say. The marshal gave a final nod to the deputies, and Silas was led away, not in chains, not today, but as a man who had lost everything that mattered and didn't even know what he'd thrown away. The crowd began to disperse. Some stayed long enough to tip their hats. A few offered tools or seeds. Others brought quiet apologies wrapped in the only language they knew. Small gestures, slow nods, shared silence. Eloise turned back toward the cabin. Gideon held the door open. She walked through it, not as a visitor, not as a burden, but as someone who had chosen to stay. Spring came late to the mountains, but when it arrived, it did so with quiet grandeur. The snow melted in slow rivulets along the cabin's roof, dripping down to kiss the earth awake. Sap rose in the trees. Buds curled open along branches like promises, and the wind carried the scent of damp soil and new beginnings. Eloise stood in the garden, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and a small shovel in her hand. The soil, once stubborn, was soft, now black, and rich from ash and time and toil. New shoots peeked out in careful rows: lettuce, yarrow, marigolds, thyme. She had marked each row with signs drawn on scraps of bark tied with twine. Around them, bees danced between the early blooms, their hum a hymn to the season. Behind her, Gideon hammered in the final beam of the new barn, his movements slow but sure. His hair had grown longer over the winter, streaked with silver. He rarely spoke while he worked, but his eyes found her more often now, and when they did, they lingered not with concern, but with quiet admiration. Not for what she did, but for what she had become. They didn't rebuild alone. The first wagon had arrived in late March, drawn not by lawmen or debt collectors, but by the Miller family from the edge of Cross Hollow. Mr. Miller brought a stack of cut lumber and a sack of nails. His son, no older than 10, carried a bouquet of wild violets and a hand-carved whistle for Eloise. The boy didn't speak at first, just placed the flowers on the porch step and ran back to the wagon. But he returned a week later with 3 friends and a basket of eggs. Sister Althea came every Sunday, sometimes with books, sometimes with seed packets, sometimes just to sit and listen. She never asked for news, never pried, but she always left with a new drawing tucked between the pages of her worn Bible, Eloise's way of saying thank you without needing to find the words. The children came often as the days warmed. They tiptoed through the garden rows, eager to hear about the singing plants, as Eloise jokingly called her chamomile, or to watch the bees move between hives. She taught them which leaves soothed stings, which flowers lured butterflies. They listened like it was scripture. Gideon carved each of them a tiny wooden animal to take home: foxes, owls, a bear cub with kind eyes. The garden, once a patch of hope hacked from wilderness, had bloomed into something unruly and radiant. It spread beyond its neat borders, vines curling over the fence, flowers climbing the trellises, herbs mingling together in fragrant confusion. It wasn't tidy, it wasn't perfect, but it was alive. One morning, as Eloise watered the far row of tomatoes, a bumblebee landed on her shoulder and rested there. She smiled, standing tall beneath the warming Sunday. The cabin behind her no longer felt like borrowed shelter. It was home. The wind no longer whispered fear. It carried laughter, now hers, Gideon's, the children's, all woven together like a lullaby for the land. The fire had come, the mountain had been tested, and still the garden bloomed. The sky stretched wide and blue over the ridge, soft clouds drifting like feathers across a world reborn. It was late afternoon, the hour when the sun turned the pines gold and shadows softened along the forest floor. Birds trilled high in the branches, and from the open door of the cabin the scent of baking bread and rosemary drifted like a memory. Eloise stood at the edge of the clearing, her hands deep in the dirt as she gently planted a new row of lavender beside the path. Bees hummed nearby, unbothered by her presence, circling lazily in the warm light. Her hair, no longer hidden beneath a bonnet, tumbled loose down her back, catching the wind like wild silk. She had grown broader in strength and stillness, in her laughter, in the way she met the gaze of those who once overlooked her. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open. Gideon stepped out, cradling something in his hands. His beard had grown fuller, his shoulders stooped just slightly more than they had in winter, but his eyes were warm now, traced with sorrow still. Yes, but no longer weighed down by it. He crossed the garden with quiet steps, careful not to crush a single sprout, and stopped just behind her. "I made something," he said. She looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her brow, her smile soft and curious. In his hands rested a crown not of gold or silver, but of carved walnut and antler, woven through with dried wildflowers and braided grass. Tiny mountain asters had been pressed into the grooves alongside soft sprigs of sage and violet. It was delicate in its way, but sturdy like her. "For you," he said, voice roughened by something deeper than wear. "For what you've built here, for who you've become." She blinked, unable to speak. He stepped closer and, with trembling fingers, placed the crown upon her head. It settled there, not like a joke, nor a gesture, but like truth, long overdue. "You were never a burden, Eloise," he said. "Not once, not ever. You were always worthy." Her breath caught. The world stilled. Then she reached up, touched the crown lightly, and laughed. A sound that belonged to her, now clear, rich, untamed. Later that day, the townsfolk arrived in twos and threes, carrying baskets and quilts, instruments and stories. Sister Althea brought a ribbon of embroidered cloth and tied it around the porch post. "For blessings," she said. Children ran between trees, goats bleated contentedly in the rebuilt barn, and someone started singing a hymn as the sun began to set. When Eloise stepped onto the front porch, the crown still resting on her brow, the crowd quieted. Gideon stood beside her, one hand gently touching her shoulder. They didn't need to say anything. Their presence together, him, once feared and alone, her, once discarded and ridiculed, was enough. The mountain had given them space. They had made something of it. And now the town, humbled and healing, stood to witness it. Eloise looked out over the faces of those who had once only seen her weight and not her worth, her silence and not her strength. And for the first time in her life, she didn't shrink beneath their eyes. She stood taller. She stood crowned. In the years that followed, the story of Eloise Mercer and Gideon Blackthorne rooted itself into the soul of Cross Hollow like the deep pines that bordered the ridge. It was told on front porches at twilight and around classroom hearths in winter, passed down in rocking chairs and carved into the wood grain of memory. Folks didn't always agree on the details. Some said the barn fire burned so hot it turned night into day. Others swore the crown Gideon carved held real gold, but no one doubted the truth at its heart. They called her the Mountain Queen, not in jest, not in pity, but in reverence. Children grew up knowing her name not as the butt of a cruel joke, but as the ending of a better story. They pointed to the hills and whispered that somewhere up there, past Devil's Creek and the white-blossomed dogwoods, lived the woman who taught bees to speak and plants to listen, and the man who once lived like a shadow but became her light. Schoolteachers told the tale when a child felt too different, too strange, too silent. Mothers used her name like a prayer when brushing their daughter's hair. You are not too much. You are not too little. You are enough, just like Eloise. And men, hard men, who once laughed when Silas Mercer boasted of his sale, lowered their eyes now when her name was spoken. Because they remembered, because they had seen the look in Gideon's face the day he stood beside her as she wore that crown of carved wood and dried wildflowers, as if she'd always been meant to wear it. The cabin became something of a pilgrimage site, though the road to it was never made easier. Those who arrived earned it through sweat and intention. Some came to trade seeds or stories. Others came for healing they couldn't name. They found Gideon there still, older now, slower, his hands more curled with time. But his eyes were softer than they'd ever been in his youth. He would nod to strangers and let Eloise do the talking. She spoke with warmth, taught with patience. She brewed salves and teas, sketched children's faces into her notebook, and sent them home with a drawing and a lesson they didn't know they needed. Some stayed a night. Some came back every spring. They never asked why she stayed. They understood. And the garden, oh, the garden bloomed wilder than ever. Vines tangled through the fence with joyful abandon, herbs burst in messy bouquets, and bees buzzed like keepers of a holy rite. It was not a tidy place. It was not a perfect one, but it was alive, and that was enough. Silas Mercer died bitter and alone, his name largely forgotten except as a footnote in the story of the girl he lost. Caldwell was never seen again after his trial, though occasionally a letter would arrive from Fort Ridge, stamped and unopened, always burned in the hearth without ceremony. The story endured, because it wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. It was about a girl who was never broken, only buried, and a man who had lost everything, only to find that love, when given freely, could return a soul to life. And so, the legend lives on, not because it is old, but because it is always becoming new. Every time a child is told they matter, every time someone chooses gentleness over fear, every time a heart, once discarded, is crowned not in gold but in belonging. Up there, in the folds of the mountains, the story still breathes, and it always will.